Hey guys, today we're going to be working on a Yard Machines 148cc lawnmower. So let's get right into her. So we got this Yard Machines here. After we sold that Brute there, we ended up picking this one up and that black one there that I showed you guys earlier. And this one, you know, it needs a carburetor, and I'll change the oil, flush the fuel tank, and well, sharpen the blade and undercoat it because it is a steel deck. But yeah, we picked these ones up, both of those for I think about 85 bucks on our way back from selling that Brute. Here's a shot of the model number and spec number, LV156XA, spec 331009A. That's all the information you need for the engine. As for the deck, here's the model number is an 11A-02 IG500. That also could be a 1. It's hard to say. And then over here for your serial number, there's all your information there. As always, I'll have all that in the description down below. Okay, so I got the lawnmower up on our little workmate table here just to get it up off the ground. Just makes working on stuff like this a little bit easier. But first things first, I can see that that bolt isn't what's supposed to be on this carburetor. And if we look over at that one back there, you guys can see these bolts are different, so that means somebody's definitely been working on this. That just falls right out, so that's not installed properly. But anyways, I'm going to start tearing this thing apart. I'm going to pull the plug, make sure that it's the right plug, and again, if it is, we'll gap it, clean it on the wire wheel. I'm going to take these nuts off here, these bolts right in there. I'll probably end up pulling the shroud too, just because, well, this one's just a couple little bolts here at the front. And I believe there's a couple at the back. This tank comes off nice and easy. This design here, you guys can see, it just slips in there, so I'll end up pulling the fuel tank right off. I'll disconnect the fuel line, and again, here's our crankcase breather tube right here. So you guys want to make sure that these are clean and free of debris. Sometimes when people overfill their machines with oil, you'll have oil that'll go from the bottom end and it'll start to rise up into the top end, and you'll get oil that'll come through here and it'll go back into your carburetor. Now that's for emissions, and this tube here, basically what that does is it vents your crankcase into the carburetor so that it can get reburned through your engine. The problem is though, all that oil residue gets into your carburetor and gums up your carburetor. So I'll get this all taken apart. As you guys can see, we got a pretty dirty air filter here. That's going to go right into the garbage, but thanks to me stocking parts, I got a brand new air filter that I can put right in there, so we can install that afterwards. A little issue that I'd like to address right now. It doesn't happen that often, but when it does, it's fooled some of the best mechanics out there. That's your governor arm right there. You guys can see just how much nasty stuff is built up on that lever. Now that lever goes back and controls your throttle. You guys can see it moving there. Now I've had a machine before where the engine was covered in so much grease that this governor arm right there wouldn't actually move. You pulled it, you primed it, you could spray carb cleaner directly into the carb, the thing would not run, because that arm would not kick back to open up the throttle on the carburetor itself. Basically what we did was we degreased the engine, hit it with a pressure washer. I bolted the intake manifold with the carburetor back on, hooked up the fuel line, hooked up a couple linkage, and that was it, guys. The machine ran great. Again, like I said, on that machine that I worked on, there was actually nothing wrong with it other than the engine just being covered in so much grease that the governor arm would not move. So that was just a little issue that I wanted to address because, again, it doesn't happen that often, but when it does, a lot of people don't think about that stuff. And one of the first things that I'm doing here, using a 7/16 socket, I'm going to remove the exhaust, and that'll give me access at our top bolt there for our intake manifold. So we'll get that off next, disconnect the fuel line and all the linkage. And using number 3 Phillips, that's the big thick one there, guys. We took out our intake manifold bolts there. And again, another thing you guys want to take note of when you're taking stuff apart is take pictures. You know, you can see that this spring here attaches to that linkage, and that goes to the bottom hole on the governor arm. And the top one comes down with this bend going in the downward position, and that goes into the hole closest to the front of the machine. So again, you guys want to take note of that. And also, this little arm here, once you get that unbolted, that's just a loose piece. You want to make sure that that goes to the outside. You don't want to put that on the inside, or else you won't have enough spring tension on your governor. Disconnect our crankcase breather tube. Looks like we got a hose clamp there on our fuel line. I don't like those. Normally don't like using those because they cut into the fuel line. So I'll probably end up putting an actual fuel line clamp on there, and this thing's coming apart nice and easy. And it looks like we got a little bit of fuel in the fuel tank there. So I just got a little jerry can here, even though it says 50 to 1. It's just an empty jerry can that I'm going to use. And if this fuel is good, which the guy said he just recently put fuel in it, there might be some nasty stuff in the bottom of this, and there might be some nasty stuff in the bottom of that. So neat little trick is after I drain the contents of the carburetor bowl and the fuel tank into this jerry can, you can end up taking a couple coffee filters and dumping that fuel through the coffee filters. It'll catch all the little dirt and debris, and you can reuse your fuel. Also, there's a thick gasket on this carburetor. I don't want to peel it off, so I'm just going to leave it on there, and if it comes off during the ultrasonic cleaning process, then that's fine, but I don't want to tear it, so we're going to leave it. Okay, so now that we got our carburetor off and we got our fuel line off, again, little pair of pliers, pinch that, and that came right off the tank, and then a little Phillips screwdriver to loosen off that hose line clamp, and that came right off of the carburetor. So now what we're going to do is get these bolts off right here. Again, when you put this back together, guys, just remember that that little bracket goes just like that. Okay, so using a couple 7/16 wrenches here and 3/8, because one of those bolts there had 3/8 head but a 7/16 nut onto it. We got our intake manifold off, so good time to take a look at our gaskets, not only on the engine side, but also on the carburetor side here. And both gaskets look to be in fairly decent condition, so we're not going to replace those. We can leave those. The outside of this carburetor here looks pretty dirty, and you guys can see all the nasty stuff starting to build up on the inside of here. So what we're going to do now is take a smaller, like a number 2 Phillips, and remove these two here. But yeah, we'll get this thing torn apart. We'll take that jet out here. This one's another fixed jet, looks like. So I'll get that taken apart, and then we'll take a 1/2-inch socket on the bottom of here and get the sediment bowl off and have a look at what the inside of this carburetor really looks like. And using a 1/4-inch socket, we were able to get these bolts holding this little air filter snap piece on, and you can just pull that right off. Now keep in mind, guys, you want this little piece here to be up on the top of the carburetor. It doesn't really matter, but there are locating brackets on your air filter housing, and if you have that in the wrong position on your air filter housing there, you could end up, like you guys see there, snapping a piece off, and that piece was barely held on. It was ready to break off any second, and that's just because sometimes, guys, if those are in the wrong position, what ends up happening is when you go to put that on, you got to bend it in a weird way, and people just try to force it on, and it ends up snapping instead of pushing it on and then clipping it in like it's supposed to. Yeah, and I'm also going to go ahead and remove this little red tube, and what that allows me to do is now I can put this into my woodworking vise there, and we'll pull off this 1/2-inch bolt at the bottom. Okay, so we got our sediment bowl off, and the inside of the sediment bowl looks pretty clean. However, our little jet at the bottom there that screws into the bottom of the sediment bowl, that's got some nasty dirt and debris in it. So I'll definitely be throwing that, as well as the entire carburetor and probably these pieces here, into the ultrasonic cleaner to get that all cleaned up. But now we can go ahead and remove this gasket here, pull this little rod out, and lift out our float as well as our needle jet. Then we could take a look at this. It doesn't look that bad, guys. There is a little bit of dirt and debris in here floating around, especially near these Welch plugs. I'm gonna blast that with the compressor, and I'm gonna blast that with the compressor just before I put it into the ultrasonic cleaner, and I'm gonna remove this jet right there. And once again, if you guys do not have an ultrasonic cleaner, which I'm sure you don't, you're gonna want to get yourself a can of this stuff here, guys. It doesn't have to be MotoMaster, but any kind of carb cleaner will do. You use that nozzle right there, and you spray into all these little nooks and crannies inside, under here, under that Welch plug there. You want to spray that, come over here where you remove that jet, spray in there, spray all in here. Try to get everything as clean as possible. You could even throw this into a dishwasher. I'm sure it wouldn't hurt, or just scrub it in the sink with some lukewarm water. Also, spray up here where your crankcase breather tube goes. You want to make sure that any of the oil residue that's coming from the engine, you blast all that stuff off. And again, you want to make sure that all these parts here are nice and clean. And again, if you have something with tiny little holes, such as this here, you want to go and get an oxyacetylene tip cleaning kit, and something like that with tiny little guys just like that, and you could end up poking through all these little holes to get all that nice and clean. Remember, there's a hole at the very bottom of that right there. Then there's a tiny little hole right up there, and then there's two holes, one down there and one over there. You want to get that nice and clean. But again, guys, same thing as your jet too. There's all kinds of little holes in there. You want to get all that stuff clean. But basically what I'm going to be throwing into the carb cleaner is the carb, the intake manifold here, my two little jets there, not the bowl because that's pretty clean, but definitely this plastic piece here and the air filter housing because that's got a lot of gunk on it. Okay, so we got a little bit of hot water here with a little bit of dish soap, and we got some of our parts already in there. I'm just going to drop the carburetor in upside down, and then again, like I did in the last video, guys, I'll probably run this for about, I'd say about 10 minutes, and then I'll go and flip the carburetor and just stir the water up. And I'm going to drop these in here as well, just like that, and we'll get this thing fired up, running, and I'll probably run it for about 20 minutes altogether. Okay, so we got all of our parts out of the ultrasonic cleaner now. I'm going to take this to the compressor and just make sure all the water's out of it, and put some air through all those small little holes. Also use my oxyacetylene tip cleaner there just to poke these jets and make sure they're clean. And then we got a nice clean piece of shop towel here, and we're using that to reassemble the carburetor so that we know it's a nice clean work environment, and no nasty dirt or debris will get into our carburetor once we assemble it. Okay, so we got all of our clean parts laid out, and once again, guys, you want to take your tip cleaner and just push it right through. Make sure you can see it come through on the other side there. Same thing with the bottom one there, and we're going to reassemble this now. So again, first thing we're going to do is get our float and our needle valve and everything ready here. If you got any stuff built up on your float, this one's pretty clean, but normally you can get some fuel that builds up in like a little film here. You just want to wash that off and make sure that's all clean. But we're going to put that back together. Again, same way we took it off. You're just going to hook this little needle jet right here up onto that bottom metal tab right there on the float, and then push your rod through, and then I'll show you how to level it once it's on. Okay, so once you get your float on, you want to make sure that it's level, so hold it up, and this one looks pretty good. If it's not level, you can go inside to that little metal tab right there that you guys can see is right on top of that little needle valve, and if you want to raise your float like this, just bend that little metal tab down, And if your float is sitting too high and you want to lower your float, then bend that little metal tab up, and you should be able to level your float. But anyways, guys, you want to make sure that that float is level, and we'll go ahead and get the gasket on, get the sediment bowl on, and then put our gasket and our bolt at the bottom. Okay, so now we know that our float is level. We have our gasket installed. Again, that one was not damaged and was still pretty thick and malleable, nice and soft, so we don't need to replace that. But now comes the important part, guys. We're going to be putting our sediment bowl back onto our carburetor, and you'll notice here that this bowl here has a raised spot and a lowered spot. So again, when this carburetor is installed on your machine, it's going to be obviously upside down, but you'll see that this float needs to open and close. When it's open, that high side of the sediment bowl needs to be to that side. So basically, you're just going to rotate it until you get it basically lined up with the high side over to here, and then you're just going to drop it on right on top, just like that. Just make sure that you don't rotate it once you know, you go to put your bolt on. And again, guys, make sure that you replace or reinstall that little gasket under there. This one's still good, so we don't need to replace it. And once again, we're over here at the woodworking vise. I have a 1/2-inch wrench here, box end, and you're just going to want to snug that up, guys. You don't want to over tighten it, because you got to remember that that's a piece of brass going into aluminum. But you want to snug it up to the point where it's nice and tight, so that once you fill this thing with gasoline, it's not going to leak out of the that bottom of the gasket there. Again, another way to check, just to make sure that everything is the way it's supposed to be with your carburetor like this in the normal position. Go ahead and blow into your fuel intake there, and you should hear a little bit of air coming through. You guys can hear that. Okay, now what you're going to do is flip it upside down. Again, blow into the gasoline intake there, and you shouldn't hear anything. Just like that, guys. So that means that our needle valve on our float is closing and opening properly as it should, and that just lets me know that it's sealing. If, for instance, I flipped it upside down and went to blow on it, and air came through both ways, or air didn't come through either way, upside down or, you know, vice versa, then I would know that my float was improperly positioned. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is reinstall our jet there, and this is a fixed jet, so there's no adjustment needed. You just screw it in right into the side of the carburetor until it's snug, and that's it, guys. Then we'll reinstall our air filter piece. And again, that's going to go like this, like I said, guys, with that little pop-up bracket on the top there. And then we will replace our gasket here that fell off during the ultrasonic cleaning process. So that'll go on there. That bolts up to our carburetor. Again, remember where that little piece went on the outside there. Okay, so we install our gasket there, and we got our bolts nice and tight now. And again, you want to have your arm there on the left side and towards the front of the machine. So right now, I'm going to put this back on, put our tube back on. Then I'll blow out our fuel line with our air compressor there, and we'll get this thing back onto the machine. And before we install that, I just wanted to tell you guys that there's supposed to be an O-ring that sits in there, and that helps keep the air filter right there, the housing, secured to the carburetor, and that just helps keep a nice little seal. And you guys can see that we're missing that O-ring, so I have one in stock here. I'm going to install it, and we'll put this back in using our 1/4-inch socket. Okay, so we got a brand new O-ring installed there, and I got that one from our little nitrile O-ring assortment kit here. So you just pop this thing open here, and I just grabbed one of the bigger ones, and that fit. And that one there looks like it's a G22 22 by 3 millimeter, and we got loads of them, so I use that for for that little guy, and that'll do the job perfectly. Also, me being the kind of guy I am, I save everything, and I do have a spare carburetor here, and this one here has a working primer bulb, and the little metal piece that goes on there to clip it in is actually secured on this one. So what you guys want to do, because on the one that we have here, these little tabs here, they weren't bent over. So once you put this on, you bend those tabs, and once those tabs open up, it locks this primer bulb into place. Now this one here has a little hole on it to release the pressure, so that might be a factor, because on this one here, you guys can see it doesn't have a hole. However, it pumps perfectly fine. So a little bit of screwing around, and I might get this one to work. If not, I'll just bend the tabs off of that one and steal that one. But again, I keep everything, so this would have come off of a machine that we scrapped. Some of the carbs that I have, the TSV and the EVS, I think they are, I got loads of these carbs, except they don't have the crankcase breather tube vent at the top. And well, you need that if it has one. I don't like to vent them into the atmosphere because you know, that could create some problems down the road. But you know, if I ever needed the spring or a linkage, let's say a linkage was bent up, you know, I pick all that off of an old shot engine, and if we scrap the engine, we might keep the deck, and we keep all these parts so that we can put another engine on the deck and salvage that. And then again, when it comes time for rebuilding a carburetor that I'm currently working on for a different machine, I end up having spare parts if I ever need them. Okay, so we got our air filter piece back on with our red tube, and now comes time to get our primer bulb installed. And this, guys, it's pretty straightforward. Basically, you have these little tabs there, and this guy just goes over top of that and locks it into place. So what you're going to want to do is, if you have a piece like this, you want to bend those tabs out, not as far as possible, but at least so they're on, I'd say a little bit of maybe a 45-degree angle, something like that. And what you're going to do is you're going to put this primer bulb in, just like that. Then you're going to take this piece here, you're going to drop that in there, and you guys can see that our tabs are just a little bit bigger than the circumference of that circle there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a socket, and I'm going to put the socket on top of that, and I'm going to force it down, and that'll bend those tabs from, you know, an outward position, and that'll bend them in slightly while it pushes it down, and those tabs will actually hold that metal clip in, and that'll keep our primer bulb from falling out like it was. Okay, so I've got an 11/16 inch socket here, and we can see that it fits over the primer bulb, and if I give it a little push, it fits over the thicker spot as well. However, it goes inside of those little tabs. So I'm going to use this socket, and I'll probably use a soft blow mallet such as this, so it's not a steel hammer. So you can use a steel hammer, but maybe put a piece of wood on top, you know, put a piece of wood on top of here and then hit it with a hammer. But I'm going to use a soft blow hammer and push that on. That's it, guys. Well, that was pretty straightforward. So now we got primer bulb that's installed the way it's supposed to be, and you guys can see that those little clips there are just pinched in enough to the point where they're holding the primer bulb in. So if I give it a little pull, yeah, that's not coming out. So that's in there nice and tight, and the previous, whoever had this previous, didn't know to use a socket to smash that down, and you know, that thing was just kind of falling out. So that's the proper way to do it. Well, I don't know if that's the proper way to do it, but that's the way that I do it. And like I said, guys, I used an 11/16 socket because well, it was just big enough to fit over the fatter piece of that primer bulb there, but thin enough where it didn't get outside of that circle there. So anyways, guys, this thing's ready to be installed on our machine. So I'm just going to clean up the workbench here, put some stuff away. Still got to blow out the line, and then we'll put this back onto the machine. We also got our fuel tank here, and I'm not sure if you guys can see it or not, but there's all sorts of little sand particles inside of there. Hard to get a shot because you know, just the way it is. But yeah, you guys can see it right in there. See all those little pieces of gunk? So I don't want any of that right there. I don't want any of that getting into our freshly rebuilt carburetor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some gasoline in here, just some old gas, and put the cap back on, give it a couple shakes, and then dump it out of the big end here, the top, and then probably do that a couple times. And again, you know, if you did what I was saying, which is, you know, you got old fuel in all these jerry cans. If you take a coffee filter and you strain the fuel, as long as it still has its octane rating, like, you know, it's fresh enough fuel within the year, you should be good enough to use it as long as it's free of debris. But if it's older fuel, what you can do is after you strain it through a coffee filter, you can go and go to like a Napa or a Canadian Tire or a parts store and buy a tiny little bottle of octane boost, and you can dump that into a big old jerry can of old fuel like that, and it freshens up the octane, and then basically you're good. It's like you got a fresh jerry can of fuel. So there's a little tip that you might not have known. Okay, so before we reinstall all of this stuff back onto the machine, there's the issue of it being very, very dirty, and I don't want to blast that with the hose when I have a brand new air filter installed, because that's going to get it all wet and all nasty. So what I'm going to do is take this shroud off, and using a 5/16 socket, we're going to remove these two screws at the front of the machine there, and around the back we're going to be using a 3/8 socket to remove those two. We'll pull this shroud right off. That'll pop right off. We'll have access to the flywheel and everything else. I'll be able to check the coil, the magnets, and see if that's gapped at the proper spec. And then what I'll do is take this outside. I'll probably tape up these holes, and I'm going to blast that with a hose and a degreaser just to clean this thing up a little bit before I reassemble everything. Okay, and once you get your bolts out, you should be able to just lift this right up and expose the flywheel, the engine, and our coil here. And if we give this a little rotate, I can take a feeler gauge in there and check our armature air gap, and I can check it here as well. Now I'm not sure what the spec for this machine is, but what I am going to do is I'll probably take a wire wheel just to clean up these magnets there, because you guys can see there is a little bit of rust starting to form on that one. Okay, so before I take this thing outside to get cleaned up, I don't want this thing getting all wet and banging around or you know, dragging on the ground. So I'm going to come up here. I'm going to see this nut right there. We're going to loosen that off, pull this out just enough so that I can slip this this rope right through that little hook there, and then basically that whole piece will be able to come off. Okay, and before I take it outside to wash it, I'm going to change the oil or just drain the oil and pull the blade, sharpen the blade, because I don't want to wash it and then drain the oil and have oil all over it. So basically, to get up under here, there's an oil drain plug, and this oil drain plug is going to be right here, guys. So what you're going to do is take an extension for a socket and put it right in there. And now normally those corrode and they could seize. So if that doesn't come out easily, then what I'll do is I'll just flip it up and drain the oil from the top oil cap, the yellow one, up top. But I'm going to pull this blade, and then I'm going to take my extension, plug it in there, and just try to crack that loose. And to get the blade off, I'll be using an impact gun with a 5/8 socket. Okay, so we got our blade off. It came off nice and easy. Just remember, guys, that this piece, this little bracket, goes like that, and then the blade goes on, and your fins here, because this is a mulching blade, your fins go up towards the top of the machine when you do go to bolt that back on. But we're going to take that and set this stuff aside here, and I will get this blade scraped off and sharpened, and then I'll balance it. Now the whole point of this, guys, isn't to take off a lot of material. It's actually just to get a nice sharp edge onto your blade. Again, once I flip it, I'll flip this way and do that side the same as this side. And then we have a little tool here. It goes up onto a top there, and you put the blade on it, and once the blade's on it, if it drops down on the left side, then you know that you have more material and more weight on this side, so then you would grind a little bit more on that side just until the blade levels itself out, and then you know that the blade is perfectly balanced. And again, guys, just take your thumb and feel for that nice sharp edge there that we now have, and that blade is good to go. So what I'll do now is, like I said, I'll balance it. And there you have it, guys. A nice, sharp, and balanced blade. So I'll drain the oil on this machine, and then we'll get the blade back onto the machine there. Okay, so using our extension, you just want to pop that in and then slowly turn it. But you guys can see that we do have it loose now. There is a little bit of corrosion there that we got to deal with. But what I'll do is I'll take that to the wire wheel once I get that out and all the oil's drained, and then I might end up putting a little bit of anti-seize onto it just to make sure that it doesn't corrode, and whoever does the oil change on this the next time won't have a problem getting that out. Okay, so I got the oil draining. I opened up the cap on the top there just to allow a little bit of airflow, and I got just a cooking pan, regular old cooking pan underneath it, because they're not that wide, but it's a little bit longer. So when you're tipping your machine, if the oil's dripping that way or this way, it can kind of catch it. But I'll get these caps cleaned up, the top one there, and clean that one up on the bottom and put a little bit of anti-seize onto it. And once this is drained, then I might flush a little bit of clean oil through it, and then I'll reinstall this one here. I'll reinstall that one as well, just so that I can take it outside and blast it with a hose and some degreaser. And then once I bring it back in, I'll install the blade and then flip it back and then put oil in it. Okay, so we're ready to put our blade back onto the lawnmower here. And you guys can see that they got this little X shape into the blade, and it's also on the blade adapter there. So you want to lock those into position, and then when you put this plate on the top of here, it's got these little nubs on them right there, and those lock into your holes on your blade there. And again, you want to make sure that these fins here are aiming up towards the top of the machine. Okay, now you just want to tighten it up until it's snug, and then grab your impact here and torque that on. Just a little piece like that, guys. You don't really need much, just enough to make sure that the water doesn't get into those ports. And with just a little bit of degreaser, it goes from looking like this to a little something like that. Okay, so we got this thing all cleaned up, so now what I'll do is take it back inside, reassemble the carburetor, air filter, and fuel tank, and then we can get some oil into it and fire it up. Okay, so we got our top shroud back on, and I'll have to do a little bit of a wipe down on that because it doesn't look as clean as the deck does now. That thing looks brand new now with a little bit of a wash onto it. But okay, so now what we'll do is take our gas tank. Again, this thing's really easy, guys. These little clips here, they just clip into the back of the housing there. And once that's clipped in and pushed down, then we can take our two bolts that we use the number 3 screwdriver to take out. We'll get those in, and then we can get our exhaust in on top of that. And once your fuel tank is installed just like that, now is the time that you want to hook up your linkage from your carburetor to your governor arm, because once you bolt it on, you'll never get that linkage on. So you want to hook it up the same way you did before. And again, your one linkage to your throttle goes on the front, your spring hooks onto that post there, and the one from the throttle goes on top, and the one from the spring there that one goes onto the bottom, just like that, guys. So now we'll take these, making sure that those don't pop out, because sometimes they do, and if that happens, then you just want to pull this carburetor back to here, hook up your linkage again, and then you can move on to the bolts. Okay, so perfect example of what I was talking about. I went to screw those bolts in and didn't notice that the bottom one, see that, just popped out a little bit. I'll probably end up just disconnecting the spring up at the top here, and then wiggle that in, and then try to hook up the spring back on top of that post with maybe a pair of needle nose pliers. So using a little pair of needle nose pliers like that, like I said, guys, I was able to put that end back in there, and then hook this end onto the post just like that. And that's exactly how you want it. When you pull the throttle, you let it go, and it snaps back just like that. Okay, now we got our crankcase breather tube hooked back up, and we have a new air filter with our air filter housing installed now. So like I said, I'm going to move on to the exhaust there and put that on, and then I'm going to pull the plug and check to make sure that it's the right one and check the gap. Okay, so I pulled the plug using a 13/16 spark plug socket, and we can see here that this plug doesn't look all that bad. Little white on the top, so it was probably running a little lean. Got a little bit of carbon buildup on the end there, but all in all, it's not that bad. And this is a First Fire FF10, and I guess that's the same as like an RJ19LM. So this plug is good. I'm going to take it over here and hit it on the wire wheel just to clean it up a bit, and we'll put that back in, get some oil into this thing, drop it down, get some gas into it, and fire it up. Okay, so what I've done here, guys, is I've just gone to Google right here on my cell phone and typed in LV156XA oil capacity, and Tecumseh came up right from their official website with just a basic PDF that I downloaded. And it says here, if you have an engine with the fill cap and not the actual dipstick, you take the lawnmower and you make sure it's level and sitting upright, and then you fill it until it reaches the cap, and that's it. So it's pretty simple. So what I'm going to use is some premium 10W30. Okay, so what I've done here is taken some Quaker State 10W30, and I've just poured about 800 milliliters into a smaller, clean, empty oil can that I had, and now it just makes dumping this into our machine a little easier than dumping a brand new jug of 10W30. So I'm just going to use a little funnel here, and we'll get that oil in until it reaches the overflow point. I've also taken my oily rag that I use for just wiping up any little spills, and I've wiped the deck down. You can see there's a nice shine on it. So basically what that does is it'll just help prevent against rust, and little film of oil on there won't hurt. Makes it look nice, and like I said, it'll help prevent against rust. Also, another good thing to talk about is you want to make sure that your O-ring, your little gasket on your oil cap is, well, that it's there to begin with, and that it's not broken, because you know, if you got this thing stored outside, or if you cut your grass, let it cool down, and then you wash it, and you don't have a little O-ring or gasket on there, you could be getting water into your bottom end, and you definitely don't want that. Okay, so I got about 400 milliliters of oil in there, and we can see that it's just starting to hit that overflow. So what I'm going to do is I'll put the cap on it, and I'm going to give the pull start cable a couple pulls just to get the crankshaft spinning in there, and get that oil circulating, and then I'll check it again, and then like I said, once I get some gas in and we get this thing fired up and running, after about a couple minutes, I'll check it again just to be sure that we're not low or not too high. Well, she runs good. I just had to get some fuel in it. The carb was a little dry, so once we got some fuel into it, she starts up right away and runs nice, idles good. So that's it, guys. So hope you enjoyed another video here at Eliminator Performance. If you did, give us a thumbs up, maybe subscribe, and check out our other videos.